All right, good afternoon. Thank you very much for participating in our webinar this afternoon. With us, we have Jenna McIntire, who is a teacher of technology education, so to speak, right now at Big Spring Middle School. Jenna is a graduate of the Penn State Teach Ag program in 2016, 15, sorry. Jenna's topic that she is sharing with us today is on adapting case curricula for her middle school, for classes in her middle school program. So Jenna's going to share that plus some other instructional strategies that she implements. So thank you, Jenna, and you can take it away.
All right, awesome. So before I begin, just to clarify, Cameron, Elise, and Killian, are you all part of the Penn State program right now, or are you teachers somewhere? Okay.
Jenna, they are all pre-service students in our program right now.
All right, I just wanted to double check that. Thank you. So can you see my screen? Let's see.
Not yet. Do you see the
share screen? Yep. Okay. All right, so can you see it now?
Yep, we got it.
Oh, perfect. Awesome. So hi, everybody. Like John said, my name is Jenna McIntire, and I graduated from Penn State a few years ago. And a little bit of background about me is I graduated in 2015, and I taught agriculture at a high school in Chester County for 2 years. And for personal reasons, I needed to move closer to my family. And so now I'm teaching agriculture and technology at a middle school at Big Spring in Cumberland County. So logistically, that works out a lot better for me. John shared that I am technically a tech ed teacher now. So the middle school that I'm at, they needed to have a tech ed teacher, but the school district saw a need to include agriculture in that. So I'm rebranding what I'm teaching to say that it's ag tech class instead of just tech ed. And that also helps students understand why they're learning about agriculture. So it's really neat to watch them start to learn about agriculture and why it's important. And in my second year of teaching middle school, I really, really love it. And I can't wait to see how this program expands and grows. So before I get too much into how I use CASE at the middle school level, I'd like to share a little bit about the structure of the middle school. So what's really neat is at Big Spring, I'm able to teach every single student at the school, and that's over the course of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So while I teach all of them, which is neat, so every year they're 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they see me. I only see them 18 days in a school year, and that's for about an hour and 40 minutes a day. So if you add that up, it's 90 hours, which is about the average time that a student would spend and I believe that's a semester class. So that's pretty cool. But it also means that I had to become quick and creative with how students kept track of their records. So that way, if they saw me first marking period of their 6th grade, they might not see me again until 4th marking period at 7th grade. I want them to be able to make that connection with material. I'll share some tools about how I do that too. So right now, the way the course is broken up, or my class, I have each marking period, I get 3 new groups of students. So that's further broken up into 2 of those sections are CASE, AF&R, which is agriculture, food, and natural resources. And those classes, the way it's labeled as a tech ed classes, I'm making sure that I'm addressing the tech ed standards. And then, so that's 4 days a week that I have 2 sections of classes. And then the 5th day is an elective class where I'm doing things with robots, and I'm also doing projects in the wood shop, which is pretty nice. So some of the tools that I was hinting at earlier that help me to keep all of this together and help students retain information over the course of 3 years, and also having a student see me like Thursday and Friday this week and not seeing me again until next Thursday, that's a long time for me as an adult. So especially for a middle school student, that's a lot to take in. So some of the things I'm using is an interactive notebook. I'm using Google School. I love the use of Google Classroom to push out information. And then I have a variety of grouping strategies. So here's an example of the interactive notebook. I started it last year with students when I was hired here. So I love the interactive notebook because it helps with consistency between the different grade levels. So like I was hinting at earlier, when I have students later on, I can say, do you remember when we learned about facets of agriculture? And if they look at me, they're like, what is Mrs. McIntire talking about? I can be like, all right, look in your table of contents on your interactive notebook. And they'll be able to say, all right, I need to flip to page 1. And then they'll be like, oh, I remember doing that. And that's been a really helpful tool because we go back to that quite a bit. And as soon as students can visualize and see that assignment that they did like a year ago or something, that's it just instantly jogs their memory. So I'm a fan of that. Again, that helps with that material retention. And there's a bunch of literacy strategies that I'm using. So I'll pull this open, students to realize, okay, this is how that lesson applies to me. This is why it's relevant. And so they're not just learning something just because it's what they're learning. They realize like, oh, it connects to me. So with the literacy strategies, every purpose that we do in class, they apply one of these literacy strategies to it, and I can see them outlined in their notebooks. So let's see, literacy strategies. Again, it shows the relationships between the lessons, and to help ensure that students have the notebooks all 3 years is I store them in my classroom. I just keep them alphabetized, and I make sure that they have them when they're ready for them. So, oh, and also they can see how each lesson builds upon each other with CASE. And I'll explain how I adapted CASE a little bit later on. So with Google Classroom, some of the things that are neat is I can share all of those assignments electronically, which I feel like that's where pretty much most of the schools are going to if they're not already there. Also easily accessible to learners, and students, their parents can help them out with that too and double check and be like, oh, what did you do in class? And they can easily pull it up. There's a Write app, you can see it down here in the corner. I'm going to pull that up to show you how that works and how I use that in class. Because I teach every single student in the middle school, I teach students who are classified as life skills students who are extremely low in terms of processing information. They have other strengths too. And then I also teach students who are gifted. And so it's a wide range of learners. And so I have several students who are legally blind and also hearing issues. So this Read and Write app is extremely helpful. So I'll go ahead and pull that up quickly for you. So the way the Read and Write app, if you look on my screen, I have this tiny little icon on my computer. So if I click on that, you see this bar that pops up at the top. I'm going to highlight a section, and it should essentially just read it to us.
All assignments electronically, easily accessible to all learners. Read and Write app helps students who struggle with reading. Huge help.
Okay, so the enunciation isn't always there, but I actually learned about this from a student who had a difficult time reading, and last year he caught my attention. He had his headphones in during my class, and I was like, what are you doing? Why do you have your headphones in? I didn't direct you to get them out. And he's like, the computer's reading to me. And then I was like, tell me more, how's this work? And so now, since that happened, I take time in the beginning of the class, each marking period, to show students about that app. And I try to explain it to them, like, if you're struggling with reading, or maybe you just don't feel like reading, so that way they don't feel singled out. I explain to them that they can use this app in my class, and that's helpful, especially so we don't always have to read a purpose or read an assignment out loud as a class or an article, because without that app, I would have to make sure somebody reads it, so that way every student can get that information, and I'm honoring their any special education needs. So again, back to Google School, students are able to have an electronic log of all of their assignments. So students from their elementary classes all the way through their senior year of high school, they should be able to access any assignment that they've handed in through Google, which is a pretty awesome educational portfolio. And then also, since the case is scaffolded, it's really nice for students to reflect on in high school. And again, the course that I'm teaching at the middle school is called AF&R. Again, that's Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources. And the reason why I'm teaching at the middle school is so the high school can offer more courses, because every lesson or every case kind of builds upon itself. So some of the grouping strategies that I'm using in my classroom right now is I have table numbers above my groups or my different table pods. So I shared that my schedule is kind of wonky, and I see students about 2 out of every 5-day cycle. So when students come in my class, they look to see their where their seat is, what table they're sitting at for that week's rotation. So for day 1 and 2, they would sit at table 4 or whichever table. So every student knows that, okay, I'm getting a new seat each week. I might not sit next to my best friend, but that's okay. And I noticed in the beginning of last year with assigned seats, it became pretty cliquey. So I needed to mix that up. And this grouping strategy works wonderfully. So I'll show you how I do that really quick, just as a tool to be helpful for you. So I actually have a column here, column C. It's a random column, and I changed the color of that font to white just so students don't see that column when I print it out for them. I'm just going to highlight those 2 columns. I'll go to my data and sort range. It has a header row, and then I'm going to sort it by random. Once I do that, students are randomly grouped. And I'll just go back through that really quickly and make sure that my students who are visually impaired, make sure that they are closer to the whiteboard. But other than that, I'm moving around my classroom all the time, so there's not truly a front of the room. But that grouping strategy helps a lot. Another thing that I learned at a Case Institute is these student grouping pencils. What's neat about them is they all have a different color. They all have a number and a shape. So there's 3 different ways students can be grouped on that. So if I want to break them up even further. So those are 2 of the things that I go to pretty regularly, and I'll mix a few other activities into. All right, so let's get to the main purpose of this webinar, why CASE? So for me, I actually bought into the CASE program. I enjoy the formatting of it, and I applied for a DIY grant through Penn State and was able to attend my first Case Institute last summer, and that was for plant science in Arkansas. And I love CASE because I think it's an awesome resource for ag teachers, as the labs are inquiry-based, the material is scaffolded, and it's cross-curricular among many different pathways. And so I just think it's really helpful. And it also provides an awesome network of teachers, and you can say, oh, how did you do this lesson? And it's just a good resource. I like CASE. It also increases the rigor in my classroom and ignites creativity. This specific lesson over here with these 4 students, we were doing labs testing pH, and there was an activity called acids and bases, and we did that. I think that was the 2nd lesson of this marking period. And after we did that lesson, students had a ton of questions, and they were like, oh, does everything have a pH? And what's the pH of my water at home? And so the next day in class, several people brought in water samples. So it could be from the stream, their well, some brought from their tap. They just brought a bottle of water in that was unopened just to see the differences. And so that was a pretty cool, and that was their idea. And students are learning that anytime they have an idea, if it relates to our lesson, I'm like, okay, let's let the craziness happen. It's a good day. We're going to be learning. It's going to be awesome. And then this over here was another case lesson that we did where we were just seeing the porosity in soil and the difference between a higher organic content and a lower organic content. So one of the things is with case, sometimes students get frustrated. They want me to just tell them the answer. I'm like, no, you have to think through it. Like, go back and reread that purpose. Let's look at some of these conclusion questions. Maybe that'll help us out. And normally once I redirect them to try to find the answer on their own, they impress themselves because they figure it out, and that's pretty awesome to watch. So again, that case is cross-curricular, and it addresses a lot of subjects. This is another example of the interactive notebook and a literacy strategy. This one here is pretty fun. Kind of simple. Students build an ice cream cone, and they just, the main part of the ice cream cone is the main idea, like the actual cone, and then they just put some supporting details. For this specific project, they had to read through a project that they were going to do and then explain some of the key points that they needed to pay attention to or make sure that they included in their project, and it seemed to work out pretty well. So at the middle school, I shared earlier that my high school at Big Spring, both of those teachers are CASE certified, and they want to offer more CASE options for students, so to provide them more options for classes. So since every student in the middle school will go through the entire introductory CASE program with myself, that means they would have checked off the first level, so then they can really dive into pathways at the high school. So the high school ag teachers, they encouraged me to get certified in AFNR. So I went to a conference this past summer, or an institute, to get that certification. There's now more opportunities for students when they get into the high school, which is awesome. And then, so at the middle school, with my crazy schedule and only seeing students 18 days a year, I had to figure out, how do I adapt this curriculum? So I first spent time seeing what lessons were already being taught by the science teachers. And there's a handful of labs that the middle school science teachers are already teaching. So I met with them this summer to see what overlap there would be between these subjects. And some of the lessons were almost identical. So there was a give and take. So some of the science teachers kept them, and they were like, oh, Jenna, you do this. And so that worked out well. I also spend a lot of time collaborating with all the special education teachers. I want to make sure that things are low enough for some of my low learners. I have a student who is functioning as a 4-year-old, and it's sometimes challenging. I think I adapted an assignment to a low enough level for him, and then, oh, I'm sorry, my light's motion censored. Sorry about that. So I think I adapted to the right level, and then I have to reduce it further. So I'm still trying to figure that out, but I also spend time, again, working with the gifted students, the gifted teacher and the autism support teachers, to make sure that it's appropriate for all of their learners. So I'll show you an example in a little bit of how I took one lesson and modified it 3 different ways. And then, so I always have all of my lessons, I make sure that I have all of those learning levels accommodated for. I'm also rearranging the CASE AFNR units to make sense for the grade levels that they're being offered. So for instance, the agri-science careers is a lesson in the very first unit of CASE. I didn't think that made sense for a 6th grader. So I think that they spend a lot of time trying to figure out where their next classes are. There's just a lot going on for a 6th grader transitioning into a new school. So yeah, I actually moved that to the end of the 8th grade unit instead of in the beginning of 6th grade, because it makes more sense for them as they're starting to think about high school, and it's starting to become a more real life scenario, like, oh yeah, I need to think about what careers I want to do. I also took a few units or a few lessons from each unit to include in each marking period. So instead of 6th grade year only talking about introduction to agriculture and the leadership component and the public speaking part. Instead of doing that, I took some animal science units or lessons and put into my 6th grade year. I took plant science and natural resources. So that way they can kind of dabble in all of the areas of ag, because I didn't want a student to be like, man, I'm only learning about plant science all 7th grade year and they not be interested in plant science. I don't want something like that to turn them off from agriculture courses in general. I want them to get a healthy splash of each element, so that way they can start saying, oh, this could be my niche. This is where I'm interested. So the variety of lessons that connect with learners. And one of the units in CASE is all about communicating and team building and being able to present speeches and things. That specific unit, I have made sure that it was broken up over all three years, just so students have that constant leadership exposure and realizing, what does it mean to be a team member? Oftentimes I do those lessons right before a group project to remind them of, here's some I can use while I'm in a group. So again, how I was adapting, this is an example of an original lesson. So this lesson, it's called Talking with Orville. Students read an article about Orville Redenbacher, who makes really good popcorn, and they're supposed to take components of that and match with all these different industries or sectors of agriculture, and they just have to write out the information. And then there's some conclusion questions for them to answer. So that's the regular unedited version. And here's 2 different versions of that same lesson. So for my lower learners, and I give myself a key to remind me that they're different versions. You look at the top here, there's 3 little smiley faces. And at the top, it's actually cut off right now, but at the top of my other lesson, I put 3 asterisks. And that's just a key for myself to know, like, okay, this goes for this group of students. But for this one here, students circle the correct answer instead of having to try to find the answer and then try to recall and write it out. That's almost too many steps for some students. Whereas my gifted learners, I've learned the first marking period that I was teaching here, that the gifted learners finished about 10-15 minutes before their peers. I'm like, okay, they need to elevate this a little bit more. So for them, I have them list evidence of the activity from the article, but then include 3 detailed answers for each. Their conclusion questions, I'm expecting them to answer using something called POQ, which is part of the question. So I want a full, complete sentence from them. Whereas the way that activity is continued for my lower level learners, for the conclusion questions, I'm giving students hints. I'm saying, why don't you go ahead and look at the answers that you just circled in this chart. So that way they have a key, like, okay, this is a tool that I can use to hopefully find that answer. And then my gifted level learners, I'm taking kind of the same concept from this Orville Redenbacher, a person, to bird's eye, for bird's eye vegetables. And students have to take different brands and spend a little bit of time researching. How did they begin? How were things packaged? Was there a reason for them to be packaged this way? And just for students to see that compare and contrast, that has been fairly successful for this lesson. Okay, so I know that I talked pretty fast, and I'm sorry, hopefully that wasn't too speedy, but I would love to answer any questions and help elaborate on anything if you would like.
Attendees, reminder, if you are joining us via Zoom, you can raise a hand to speak or type your questions into the chat box. If you're joining us by phone, you can unmute and kind of jump in as needed. Anybody have any questions for Jenna?
So another thing to share, I'm kind of at a cross between, oh, let's see, we have a question here. Oh, yeah, so that's a good question, Killian. So actually, when I see students, she said, how do you decide on what lessons to pull for a short time period? And one of the things I do is I'll look, well, first I make sure I don't teach the same lessons that the science teachers are teaching. And then I just try to take the lessons from case and divide up over 3 years. So I actually, over the 3 years, the students will get through the entire case unit, or I'm sorry, the entire case course for AFNR. And so that will be helpful. It's just trying to match the lesson with an appropriate grade level. So I am able to get through the lessons. And when I see students now, I see them 110 minutes each class. So it's a pretty lengthy time. So hopefully that answers your question, Killian.
Anyone else have any questions for Jenna? Anybody that joined on after we got rolling here that's needs a little bit of guidance with the technology? If you have access to the chat box, you can kind of ask for help there. Anybody else? Jenna, what case lessons do you out of the AFNR curriculum do your students seem the most responsive to and enjoy the most?
The lessons that are more inquiry based or like project based, the hands-on things they enjoy much more than having to just do like a web quest for something. There's a project on ecosystems that they're learning about, and they love that because it involves creating two different things. For instance, they need to make a 3D model, and I have a ton of different resources in my classroom, and I tell them that they can use whatever they'd like. And so it kind of sparks their creativity. Sometimes I'll get a little frustrated with that just because they want the answer just given to them. But after they get over that initial frustration, they get really into it and engaged. So there's that. Let's see. The lessons with pH they enjoy. Let's see, there's a lab, I call it the Jello lab, but the actual title of the lab is called Measure Me, where students have to measure out a cube. And again, the measuring's hitting on some of the tech ed standards. They have to measure out a perfect 15 centimeter by 15 centimeter cube, which takes a bit of time for them to be able to do it correctly. And then they have to make Jello, but they don't realize that they're making Jello. They just know that it's an unknown chemical. So the element of surprise is really cool. So anytime there's a lesson that can have a surprise factor or just keeps them guessing, it just kind of keeps them hooked the whole time, which is pretty cool. Oh, and there's also some team building lessons that they like a lot.
Do you find that the AFNR curriculum is very conducive to use with middle school age students? Is there a lot that you feel might be over their head, kind of beyond the middle school level, or does it all naturally kind of fit to where your middle schoolers are at?
Yeah, good question. So I would say, honestly, that a lot of the material is almost too much for the middle schoolers, but that's a good thing. So what I do with the lessons is I make sure that the purpose, I make sure that I kind of take it down to an appropriate level for them so that way they can understand it. There's a lot of new vocab words that we learn. So again, as we read through an assignment or through a purpose, I'm like, what does this word mean? Let's use some context clues. Maybe we can figure it out. And normally somebody's able to help teach the class on that. I like that the case AF&R is a bit challenging for middle school students because it brings them up. It forces them to go a little bit outside their comfort zone and to think deeper about the subject. So yes, it's a little bit challenging for them, but I think a challenge is a good thing, and my students are rising to that occasion. And at the very least, with the hands-on labs, they're hooked on the lesson, and they want to figure out what it is that maybe they don't fully understand about the assignment just because they want to understand the end product. So it's almost like a backwards design learning. They're like, okay, this is a cool thing at the end, but how did I get there? So it leads to some good discussions.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have any questions here? We have about 25 minutes left in our scheduled time. However, if nobody else has any more questions, we can adjourn a little early. So I'll kind of make the pitch one more time for questions, comments. Jenna, would you mind typing in the chat box your email again? Sure. For anybody on the there's one from Killian. Go ahead and address that question then.
I think that's the same question. Like, how do you decide on what lessons to pull for a short time? I thought I hit the answered button for that. So
no. She wrote it in the chat box. Sorry. How do you assess students?
Oh, okay. Okay. So I don't see the chat box. Okay, so right now how I'm assessing, oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Thanks, Killian. So right now how I'm assessing students is through their notebook. I check on their competency for actually review materials. I have a rubric here. You can kind of see if I move it closely. Several times a marking period, I'll grade them, and it'll be 40 points each notebook check. I'll grade them based off of their table of contents and is it organized, and the vocab words that we use, make sure that they have them, and I've used them as a tool, but then all work is complete to the best of ability. So at first I had all work is complete, and then I quickly changed that to say the best of their ability. That's one of the main ways that students are graded. Every project that we do in class is graded, so a lot of kind of project based for the grades, and probably once or twice, like twice a marking period, we'll use a quiz on a specific unit. And to go back to your question earlier, John, another assignment that they really like is learning all about the flower identification from the plant unit. That seems to be a really popular assignment where they're learning all the different components and the reproductive system within the flower. But yeah, I don't do a lot of tests or essays for my students. And I think I might incorporate that a little bit more next year, because I have heard from the principal that our schedule is going to change. So instead of students having me like 2 out of every 5 days, it's going to be 3 out of every 6, but for a semester long. And I was told that I'll learn more about that in January, about how our schedule will look next year. So I think some of the things will change just a little bit to adapt.
That just sparked another question, Jenna. Knowing that some of the case lessons and activities can span multiple days, how do you plan, especially, if you have some sort of rotational schedule, how do you plan activities with classes that's going to span multiple days if you may not see students every single day?
Yeah, excellent question. That's a really kind of sticky spot that I'm in right now, trying to make that work. And honestly, what I'm doing right now is sometimes the same lab will carry over two different groups of students. So that way, if day one start out of our 5-day cycle, if day one starts on Monday, then those students can set up the lab, but then kind of monitor the progress on Tuesday. But then on Wednesday and Thursday, my day 3 and 4, that class I can be like, okay, here's what happened. This is all set up for you, but now you're responsible to help share and communicate this information with the classes that I have scheduled on days 1 and 2. You're going to finish the lab for them. And so sometimes they'll share that way, and that's helpful, but I wish that the same class could see something all the way through instead of just having to kind of communicate with each other about like, oh, we did this part, you guys do this part. And so next year when students have me more consistently, or at least 3 days in a row, I think that'll help a lot. Then with students seeing me a full semester as opposed to just a marking period, I think the retention and the depth that we'll be able to go with the case curriculum will be far superior. So I'm excited to see the growth within this next school year.
Okay, excellent. Okay, we'll go ahead and make a final call for any questions any of our attendees have for Jenna. While you might be typing any of those in there, we want to thank Jenna so much for putting this presentation together for us. Excellent resource that was shared. Jenna, could you name that resource again for any of the attendees that may have logged on after you went through that, the text reading app?
Oh, that's called a Read Write app. It looks like a purple puzzle piece. Yeah, so I just shared my email address. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions, or if you need advice. I'd love to help, and kind of need to see the comparison between high school and middle school. And when I was at Penn State, I didn't really think that I would be teaching at the middle school level, but now that I'm here, I love it, and to watch the excitement with students, pretty cool, and definitely a higher energy level.
Jenna, I really do appreciate you sharing, and I'm proud that we were able to invest in your professional development. The key to all of this, team, because I know this will be recorded and will be shared out as a reusable artifact, is teachers helping teachers when we invest in teachers because teachers matter. So we invested in Jenna, and through her voice and experience, she can relate to you and how her professional development adventure, this time case, can apply to middle school in Pennsylvania and make it truly contextually specific to the Pennsylvania situation. So Jenna, do know while sometimes we can look down and see perhaps not the hundreds of attendees that we would like, and that the value of having this recorded where we can send it to that teacher says, I'm in middle school, what do I do, is indeed immense and does provide long-term lasting value. So thank you very much for completing this task.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off that, I'm very grateful for the opportunities put out through Penn State. I think we do have one of the leading universities in our country for agriculture education. And so some pretty awesome opportunities. Make sure as you graduate that you continue to take advantage of them and that you're engaged.
Before I log off, I'm just going to tell everybody one more time to have a really nice Christmas. So everybody have a really nice Christmas, and I'll see you down the road.
Yes, and on that note, Dr. Foster mentioned the DIY funding program that Jenna used to attend this Case Institute. We have once again budgeted this year additional funding available. We have had to the best of my knowledge, we haven't had no specific requests from anybody for a DIY project that they wanted to pursue as far as professional development. So any in-service teachers on the call today, as well as any that view this recording, there is still DIY funding available to in-service teachers for the remainder of this year. So anybody that's interested, please take advantage of that unique opportunity. Okay, if nobody else has any other questions or comments, we can go ahead and